She screamed it straight into his face, not a cry, not a whisper. A full, raw, chest-splitting scream, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than anger, from a place where a person has been silent so long that when the sound finally breaks free, it doesn't sound like a voice anymore. It sounds like something tearing. They didn't send me here to grow, they sent me here to break me. Caleb Mercer didn't step back. Didn't blink. 14 years in the United States Navy had taught him that the moment you flinch is the moment you lose. He stood there steady as a fence post in frozen ground and let her scream land exactly where it was aimed. Then very quietly, he said the 4 words that changed everything. Then they sent you wrong. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it grabs you, hit subscribe. You won't want to walk away before the ending. The morning Caleb Mercer's life changed forever started exactly like every other morning had for the past 5 years, with silence that was too heavy to be peace. He was up before the sun, the way the Navy had taught him, and the way grief had reinforced. His boots hit the floor at 4:47 a.m. He didn't need an alarm. His body had learned that sleep was a privilege, not a right, and that the farm didn't care what kind of night you'd had. He pulled on his flannel shirt in the dark, moving quietly out of habit. Maisie's room was just down the hall, and even at 9 years old, she still slept like she was holding on to sleep for dear life. He understood that. When you'd lost someone the way she had, the way they both had, sleep was the only place the world still made sense. He got the coffee going, stood at the kitchen window, and looked out at nothing. Gray sky, gray ground. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, it just settled in your chest and stayed. Montana in late October was beautiful if you were visiting. If you were living it day after day, mortgage payment after mortgage payment, it was something else entirely. He drank his coffee standing up. He always did. There was a framed photo on the windowsill. Sarah, maybe 26 in the picture, laughing at something off camera, her hair blown sideways by wind. She didn't mind. He didn't move the photo. He didn't look away from it either. He just lived beside it, the way you learn to live beside anything that both hurts and holds you together. 5 years, he thought. 5 years, and it still hits the same. He set the mug down, buttoned his coat, and went out to start his day. He was on his back under the south fence line by 9 o'clock, wrestling a rusted post anchor that had been giving him trouble since August. His hands were bleeding at the knuckles, not badly, just the kind of scrape that comes from metal that doesn't care about you, and he was halfway through a sentence of profanity when he heard it. Tires on gravel. Not the sound of Tommy Briggs's old pickup, which rattled and announced itself half a mile out. Not the UPS truck, which always slowed to a crawl before it turned. This was something else. Something smooth and expensive, the kind of sound that didn't belong on a dirt road that hadn't been properly graded since the county stopped caring. Caleb slid out from under the fence and stood up. A black sedan, long polished, the kind of vehicle that cost more than his entire first year's harvest, had rolled to a stop about 30 feet from his front porch. The engine cut. Nobody got out for a long moment. He watched it. He'd learned in the Navy that a vehicle that sits still too long before anyone emerges is either lost or planning something. Neither option tended to end simply. Then the passenger door opened. She stepped out, and Caleb's first thought was not what he expected. His first thought was, she's terrified. He'd seen fear before. Real fear, not the kind people perform. He'd seen it in the faces of young sailors who'd just realized the world was larger and more dangerous than they'd been told. He'd seen it in Maisie's face the morning after the funeral, when she woke up and remembered all over again. This woman, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing clothes that fit the car, but not the situation, was carrying that exact kind of fear. She was holding herself very still, the way prey animals do when they're deciding whether to run. A man in a dark suit climbed out of the driver's side. He straightened his jacket, looked around the farm with the expression of someone who'd been asked to deliver a package to the moon, and then turned to the woman. "Ms. Langford." His voice carried across the yard. "This is the address." The woman, Ms. Langford, looked at the farmhouse. She looked at the fence line. She looked at Caleb, who was still standing there with blood on his knuckles and grease on his coat. And for just a second, something crossed her face that wasn't fear. It was something closer to, "What have they done to me?" Caleb walked toward them. "Can I help you?" he said. Not unfriendly, but not warm either. The man in the suit stepped forward. He had a briefcase and the posture of someone who was accustomed to solving other people's problems with paperwork. "Mr. Mercer, Caleb Mercer." "That's right. My name is Richard Solt. I represent the Langford family. We spoke with your county agricultural office last month regarding the rural residency program." "I remember," Caleb said. He did barely. Someone from the county had called him about some kind of pilot program where families with means could sponsor a practical living experience for young adults. He'd said he'd think about it. He hadn't thought about it much. "I didn't agree to anything." "No, sir, you expressed openness to the arrangement. The Langford family has reviewed your property and your background and believes this is an appropriate placement." Solt opened his briefcase, produced a folder. "There's a monthly stipend involved, quite generous, and the stay would be no more than 90 days. Caleb looked past him at the woman. She was staring at the ground now. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not the way someone crosses their arms when they're cold, but the way someone holds themselves together when they're trying very hard not to fall apart. "Ma'am," Caleb said. She looked up. "You want to be here?" The suit shifted. "Mr. Mercer, the terms of the arrangement. I'm asking her." Silence. The woman Ava, he would learn, held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she said very quietly, "I don't have a choice." Solt cleared his throat. "That's not quite accurate. Ms. Langford has agreed to this placement as part of—" "Stop talking," Caleb said. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't need to be. Solt stopped talking. Caleb took a breath. He looked at the sedan, at the suit, at the folder, at the woman who looked like she'd been delivered somewhere against her will, and was now trying to decide whether to fight or accept it. He said, "Give me a minute." He walked back to the fence line, picked up his tools, and stood there for 30 seconds, doing nothing but thinking. He thought about the stipend, which, if it was what the county contact had implied, would cover 2 months of mortgage. He thought about Maisie, who would be home from school in 6 hours. He thought about Sarah, who had never once in her life turned someone away from their door. He thought about the look on that woman's face. "I don't have a choice." He came back. "She stays," he said. "The car and the suit leave by noon." Solt was gone by 11:40. He'd made several attempts to outline terms and conditions and liability clauses, and Caleb had listened to exactly enough of it to understand that the Langford family wanted their daughter placed somewhere that felt like punishment, but was technically safe, and that they were paying for the guarantee of both. He signed what needed to be signed. He took no pleasure in the stipend, but he was practical enough not to refuse it. When the sedan finally pulled back down the dirt road and disappeared, the yard went quiet. Caleb turned to find Ava Langford standing on his porch with a single leather bag at her feet, and an expression that was hard to name. Not gratitude exactly, not relief. Something more complicated than both. "You should know," she said, "I have never done a single thing on a farm in my life." "I figured. I don't know how to do whatever it is people do here." "You'll learn." She looked at the bag, then at him. "Why did you tell him to leave?" Caleb considered that. "Because you looked like you needed someone to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, almost despite herself, "That's either very kind or very stupid." "Probably both," he said. "Come on, I'll show you where you're sleeping." The room he gave her was small. It had been a storage room before Sarah got hold of it and turned it into a proper guest room with a hand-stitched quilt and curtains she'd sewn herself. Caleb hadn't changed any of it. He kept meaning to. Ava set her bag on the bed and stood in the middle of the room like she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall," Caleb said from the doorway. "My daughter Maisie gets home around 3:30. She's 9. She asks a lot of questions. Don't feel obligated to answer all of them." "How long has it just been the two of you?" He paused. 5 years. "I'm sorry?" "Her name was Sarah." He said it like a statement of fact, but they both understood it was something more than that. Ava nodded slowly. I lost someone too, she said. Not the same way, but I understand what it means to have someone just gone. He didn't ask who. Not yet. There was a time for those conversations, and it wasn't in the first hour. Lunch is at noon, he said. I don't cook fancy, but it's enough. Work starts at 1. You'll start with the lighter tasks until you get your footing. Mr. Mercer. He stopped. Why did they really send me here? She asked. Not to him exactly. More to the room, more to herself. But he answered anyway. I don't know. But you said you don't have a choice. He met her eyes. I want you to know that while you're on my property, that's not true. You always have a choice. That's the one rule I don't bend on. She stared at him for a long moment, and he watched something happen in her expression. Something small and fragile and real, like the first crack in ice that's been frozen too solid for too long. She didn't say thank you, but she nodded. That was enough. Maisie came through the door at 3:32, dropped her backpack in the hall, exactly where Caleb had asked her 100 times not to drop it, and then stopped dead when she saw the woman sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Dad! She didn't take her eyes off the stranger. There's a lady in our kitchen. I see that. Did you know there was going to be a lady in our kitchen? I did. Maisie considered this. She was 9 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had learned early that the world did not always announce its changes in advance. She walked to the table and extended her hand with the formality of someone who had watched too many adult interactions. I'm Maisie Mercer, she said. Ava looked momentarily caught off guard, like she hadn't expected to be taken seriously, and then she shook the offered hand. Ava Langford. Are you a friend of my dad's? Not yet, Ava said. Maisie turned to Caleb with the expression she used when she was filing information away for future reference. Okay, she said, and went to get a snack from the cabinet. Ava looked at him across the table with something very close to a smile, the first one he'd seen from her. She's remarkable, she said quietly. Yeah, he said. She is. That night, after Maisie was in bed and the farm had gone dark, and still, Caleb sat on the porch steps with a bottle of beer he'd barely touched, and he let himself think about what he'd done. He'd brought a stranger into his house. A stranger with money behind her and fear in front of her, and a story she hadn't told yet. He'd let her sleep in Sarah's guest room and shake his daughter's hand and drink tea at his kitchen table. He was either doing the right thing or making a significant mistake. He had learned in 47 years of living that those two things were very often the same. A sound behind him, the screen door easing open. He didn't turn around. Ava sat down on the step beside him, not close, but not far. She had a blanket from inside pulled around her shoulders, and she looked up at the Montana sky, the way people look at things they weren't prepared for. I've never seen stars like this, she said. City. Boston. Then New York. Then wherever they needed me to be. She paused. My family has a lot of opinions about where I should be. And where do you think you should be? She was quiet for a long time. I used to know the answer to that question, she finally said. I don't anymore. He nodded. He understood that particular kind of lost, the kind that doesn't come from not knowing where you are, but from not recognizing who you've become. What actually happened? He asked. Not the story Salt told me. The real one. She pulled the blanket tighter. They want me to marry someone, she said. His name is Graham Hartley. She stopped. Started again. He's the kind of man my father does business with. The kind of man who gets what he's told he can have. And they told him he could have you. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. They've been building toward it for 2 years. It's not arranged exactly. It's more like a current. You're in it before you realize, and by the time you understand where it's taking you, you're already most of the way there. Her jaw was tight. When I pushed back, really pushed back, this is what they came up with. Ship her off to a farm for 3 months. Wear her down. Bring her back compliant. Caleb turned and looked at her directly. Is that going to work? She met his eyes. They sent me here to punish me, she said. That's what I told their lawyer when he handed me the folder. He didn't deny it. And what do you want? The question seemed to surprise her. Like wanting something was a possibility she'd stopped calculating. I want to not be afraid anymore, she said. I want one single morning where I wake up and the first thing I feel isn't dread. The breeze moved across the yard, and somewhere out in the dark, one of the horses shifted and settled. Caleb took a slow breath. I can't promise you much, he said. This farm is hard work, and the winters are brutal, and I'm not easy to talk to before my second cup of coffee. He paused. But I'll tell you this, nobody on my property gets worn down. Not while I'm standing. She studied him for a moment, the way people study things they haven't decided whether to trust yet. Why do you care? She asked. You don't know me. No, he said. But I know what it looks like when someone needs a person to be straight with them. He picked up his beer, looked at it, set it back down. I was a Navy man for 14 years. You want to know what the most dangerous thing in the ocean is? It's not the storm. It's not the enemy. It's the feeling that nobody's watching your back. He looked at her. You've got somebody watching your back now. That's all I'm saying. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was different, quieter, stripped of the careful composure she'd been maintaining since she stepped out of that car. Mr. Mercer, she said. Caleb. Caleb. She said it like she was testing the weight of it. Thank you. He nodded once, stood up, picked up the beer. 4:30 wake up around here, he said. I'll try to be quiet. I don't sleep much anyway. Then you'll fit right in. He went inside. Ava sat on the steps alone for a long time, looking up at a sky full of stars she'd never known were there, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she let herself exhale. The farm was quiet. The stars were out. And something had begun that none of them, not Caleb, not Ava, not Maisie, not the Langford family with all their lawyers and all their money could yet understand the full shape of. But it had begun. The first morning, Ava was up before Caleb. He came downstairs at 4:30 and found her already at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug she'd made herself, staring at the steam rising off the surface like it owed her an explanation. She was still wearing the clothes she'd arrived in, dark slacks, a blouse that cost more than his monthly electric bill, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had not slept and was refusing to admit it. He stopped in the doorway. Coffee's fresh, she said without looking up. I found the filters. Good. He poured himself a cup, leaned against the counter, and looked at her. You sleep at all? Some. That mean no? She looked up then. That means some. He let it go. He understood the particular kind of pride that wouldn't let a person admit to a bad night in someone else's house. He'd felt it himself in the months after Sarah, when his mother had come to stay, and he'd told her every morning that he was fine, and she'd looked at him every morning knowing he wasn't, and neither of them had pushed it further. Some kindnesses look like letting things alone. He pulled on his coat. I start with the horses. Then the fence line on the east side post came loose in the freeze last week. After that, the hay storage needs sorting before it rots. You're with me today, so you know where things are. He picked up his mug. Dress warmer. What you're wearing won't last 20 minutes out there. She looked down at herself like she was seeing her clothes for the first time and realizing they were the wrong answer to a question the farm was asking. I don't have back closet end of the hall. Sarah kept extra work gear in there. Should be something close to your size. He was already heading for the door when she said it quietly, almost to herself, but he heard it. Sarah. He stopped. Your wife, she said. Yeah. Does it bother you? Me using her things? He thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. The true answer was simpler. She would have wanted them used, he said. She didn't believe in keeping things just to keep them. He pushed the screen door open. 5 minutes. She was ready in 4. She came out in one of Sarah's old canvas coats, a wool hat pulled down over her dark hair, and a pair of work gloves that were slightly too big. She looked nothing like herself from the day before. She looked, Caleb thought, almost like someone who belonged here, or at least like someone who was willing to try. He said nothing about it. He just handed her a shovel and started walking. The first hour nearly broke her. He could see it the way her breath came too fast, the way her shoulders climbed toward her ears with each new task, the way she'd look at a fence post or a hay bale and spend a half-second calculating whether she could do it before forcing herself to start. She didn't complain. That surprised him. He'd expected complaints, had prepared himself for them the way you prepare for weather you know is coming. But she just worked silently, getting it wrong and adjusting and getting it slightly less wrong, and he didn't say much except what needed saying. Grip lower on the handle. Other side. Don't use your back, your legs. She listened. That surprised him too. By mid-morning, they were at the east fence line, and Ava was hammering a post anchor with a mallet that was clearly heavier than she'd anticipated, and she brought it down wrong, and it glanced off the metal, and she said a word that made Caleb raise an eyebrow. She caught his look. "I went to boarding school in Connecticut," she said. "We learned all the words." He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to one since she'd arrived. "You're angling wrong," he said. He stepped in behind her, not touching, just close enough to show. "You want the strike coming straight down, not across. The metal doesn't give you dew if you're not aligned." She adjusted, brought the mallet down again. The anchor caught and sank. She stood up and looked at it with an expression so purely satisfied that it stopped him for a moment, because it was real, completely unguarded, the kind of feeling that doesn't perform itself, and it made him realize that wherever Ava Langford had come from, she hadn't been allowed to feel that particular thing, the plain, honest satisfaction of doing something hard with your own hands, in a very long time. "First fence post," he said. "First fence post," she repeated. He picked up his tools and kept moving, but the moment stayed with him. Shut that. Maisie was home at 3:30 again, backpack in the hall again, and this time when she came into the kitchen and found Ava, she didn't stop short with surprise. She climbed up onto the chair across from her, set her chin in her hand and said, "You came back." "I live here now," Ava said. "For a while. Do you like it?" Ava considered the question with more seriousness than Maisie had probably expected. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I fixed a fence post today. That felt good." Maisie processed this. "Dad's really particular about his fence posts." "I noticed." "Did he say it was okay?" "He didn't say it wasn't." Maisie gave a nod that somehow conveyed that this was the highest form of Caleb Mercer approval available. "That's basically the same thing," she said. Ava laughed, and it was different from any sound she'd made since arriving. It was loose, unplanned, the kind of laugh that comes out before you can decide whether to let it. Caleb heard it from the hallway and didn't walk in right away. He stood for a second listening to his daughter talk to this woman like they'd known each other longer than a day, and he felt something move in his chest that he wasn't ready to name. He went in and started dinner. Maisie, as was her habit, provided running commentary on everything, including a detailed account of a conflict at school involving two boys of basketball, and a fundamental disagreement about the rules and what should have been done about it, and what she had in fact said about it, and why she stood by every word. Ava listened with her full attention, the way some adults do with children, and most don't, and asked questions at the right moments, and Maisie blossomed under it the way she always did when someone gave her that actual, genuine attention. Caleb watched from the stove. He thought Sarah would have liked her. He thought, "Stop that." He set plates on the table. It was the 4th day when Ava's composure finally cracked. Not dramatically, not in any way she'd meant to show, but he saw it. They'd been in the barn working through the hay storage, and Ava had gotten quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was active, focused, paying attention. This quiet had a weight to it, like something pressing from inside. Caleb kept working. He'd learned that pushing at that kind of quiet made it close up. Sometimes you just had to let it sit until it was ready to open. Then she stopped moving entirely, hands flat on a hay bale, and said, "He called again." Caleb straightened. "Graham Hartley." Through the lawyer, Solt left me a message. She kept looking at the hay bale. "He said Graham wanted me to know that he wasn't angry, that he understood I needed space." The word landed like something she'd bitten down on. That's what they're calling it, space. Like this is a tantrum. What do you want to say back? I want to say that I am not a piece of property that got temporarily misplaced. She still didn't look up, but her voice had an edge to it now, the kind that comes just before it breaks. I want to say that my father shook a man's hand over me like I was something he was transferring the deed to. Caleb put down his work gloves. He leaned against the barn post and looked at her directly. Then say that. To who? To Solt. To Graham. She finally looked up, and her eyes were dry but barely. The people I would need to say it to are the same people who have decided it doesn't apply. Say it to me, he said. She stared at him. Right now, he said. Say exactly what you want to say. Doesn't matter if I already agree with you. Say it out loud to an actual person so it stops just living in your head. Something shifted in her face, and then she did slowly, at first, then faster, then all of it coming out in a rush that she'd clearly been holding for months, maybe years. She talked about her father, a man she'd wanted to admire, and had spent most of her adult life trying to earn something from. She talked about Graham Hartley, who was polished and pleasant, and looked at her like she was a column in a ledger, favorable, valuable, correctly placed. She talked about the way her mother had stood in the hallway of their Boston house and said, "Ava, sometimes love is a decision you make for your family," and what it had meant to hear that from the woman who was supposed to be on her side. Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He just stood there and received it the way solid ground receives rain, not solving it, not redirecting it, just holding it. When she stopped, the barn was quiet. She let out a long, slow breath. "I'm sorry," she said. Don't apologize. I don't usually. I know. Why?" He picked his gloves back up. "But you needed to." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you do that? Just stand there and take all of it without looking like you want to run." He thought about that. "Practice," he said. "And because I know what it costs a person to hold all of that in, and I'm not going to be the one who makes it cost more." She studied him for a long time. "You're a strange man, Caleb Mercer." "So I've been told." "I mean it as a compliment." "I know." She picked up her work gloves. "Back to the hay." Back to the hay. The conversation that changed things happened on a Tuesday night 11 days after she'd arrived. Maisie had gone to bed. The farm was still. Caleb was at the kitchen table going through bills, the kind of arithmetic that didn't improve no matter how many times you ran it, and Ava was across from him with a cup of tea, and what he'd learned was her reading posture, which meant she was actually thinking and not reading at all. She put the book down. "Can I ask you something personal?" He looked up. "Depends." "The Navy. Why'd you leave?" He set down his pen. "Maisie." "Because Sarah was gone." "Because I'd been away enough. Because she'd already lost one parent, and I wasn't willing to be an absent second one." He paused. "The farm was Sarah's family's. When she died, it came to us, to me and Maisie. It was either sell it or work it." He looked at the bills. "I don't quit things." "No," Ava said, like she'd already figured that out. "You don't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The farm is behind, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. He looked up slowly. "I'm not prying," she said. I've watched you at that table every night, and I recognize that look. My father had it for about 6 months when I was 12 before he made the deal that changed everything for our family. That look means the numbers don't work, and you've been staring at them long enough to have them memorized." He leaned back in his chair. "It's manageable." "Is it?" He said nothing. "Caleb." She said his name the same way she had on the porch that first night, carefully, like she was deciding whether she was allowed. I worked in finance for 4 years before my family decided my most valuable contribution to the world was marrying the right man. I know what books in trouble look like. I'm not asking for help. I know you're not. I'm offering it. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze steadily, and he could see she meant it not as charity, not as a way of paying for her room and board, but as something genuine, something she had and could give and wanted to give. I don't want pity, he said. Good, because I don't have any for you, she said. I have a finance degree from Wellesley and 4 years of investment portfolio management, and I've been shoveling manure and fixing fence posts for nearly 2 weeks, and if you won't let me do the one thing I'm actually trained for, that's not pride, Caleb. That's stubbornness. He stared at her. She stared back. He pushed the folder of bills across the table. She pulled it toward her and opened it without ceremony, and within 20 minutes, she'd found 3 things. He'd been missing: a tax relief credit he qualified for, but hadn't filed a renegotiable supply contract he'd assumed was fixed, and an equipment lease that was costing him 40% more than it should have been. She walked him through all of it quietly and precisely, and he sat across from her and listened. When she finished, she closed the folder and slid it back. That's the start of it, she said. If you'd let me look at the full picture, I think there's a path. He was quiet. You didn't have to do that, he said. You stood in that barn and let me say everything I needed to say and didn't make it cost me anything, she said. This is the same. He picked up the folder, looked at it, looked at her. You want more tea? He asked. She smiled, and this time it wasn't just loose and unguarded. It was warm, wide open, and he felt it in the room like a change in temperature. Yeah, she said. I do. It was Maisie who said it first, which was usually how the clearest truths got said in that house. 3 weeks in, she and Ava were sitting on the porch steps after dinner, and Maisie was telling a story about something that had happened at school, and Ava was listening with both elbows on her knees, turned toward her fully. There, and Maisie stopped mid-sentence and said, Ava, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you going to leave when your time is up? Ava went quiet. I don't know yet, she said. Maisie considered this. I hope you don't, she said simply, factually the way 9-year-olds deliver the truest things, and then went right back to her story. Ava kept her face toward the yard and said nothing, but when Caleb came out with 3 glasses of lemonade and sat on the top step, she looked at him briefly, just briefly, and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. He handed her a glass. She took it. Maisie kept talking. The sun went down over the Montana hills, and the 3 of them sat there together as the dark came in, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb's porch didn't feel like a place where a man sat alone with the weight of everything he'd lost. It felt like something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, but recognized the way you recognize a song you heard once as a child. Not the title, not the words, just the feeling of it, deep and familiar, arriving from somewhere you thought was gone. It was on a Thursday 23 days after the black sedan had come down his dirt road when the phone rang. Caleb was outside. Ava answered it. He came in to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen, the phone in her hand, the color gone from her face. Who was that? She set the phone down. When she looked at him, the composure was back, that careful armored composure she'd come in wearing, that he'd watched her set aside piece by piece over 3 weeks, and the sight of it returning was like watching a door close. My father, she said. He's coming. Caleb didn't move. Coming here. He says Graham wants to meet, that they want to discuss the situation. Her jaw was tight. He said it in that voice he uses when he's already decided how things are going to go. Caleb crossed his arms. When, he said next week. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside a wind came up and moved across the roof. Ava. She looked at him. You remember what I told you the first night you were here? She was quiet for a moment. Then quietly. That nobody on your property gets worn down. That's right. He held her gaze. So let them come. She looked at him for a long time. The composure was still there, but underneath it, he could see something shifting. That ice he'd first watched crack in the doorway of the guest room, opening further, now slowly, carefully, like she wanted to believe him, but the wanting itself was something she'd learned to be afraid of. "You don't know my father," she said. "No," he said. "But he doesn't know me either." She held that, turned it over, nodded once. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and the farm stood against it the way it always had, not because nothing could touch it, but because it had been built by people who stayed. He came on a Wednesday, not next week, the way he'd said on the phone 4 days early, without warning, without a call, without the courtesy of giving anyone time to prepare. That was how men like Robert Langford operated. You didn't give warning. Warning was for people who respected the other person's right to be ready. Caleb was in the middle of repairing the water line on the north side of the property when Ava came out of the house and walked toward him with the kind of walk that told him everything. Before she said a word, straight back, measured steps, her hands loose at her sides, the way a person holds themselves when they're working very hard to look like they're not afraid. "He's here," she said. Caleb didn't look up from the pipe immediately. He finished the turn he was making with the wrench, tested the joint, then stood up and wiped his hands on his work rag. "How many?" "Him. And Graham." He looked at her then. "Graham came." "Yes." He read her face, the tight jaw, the careful blankness she put over the fear, and he thought about what it cost a person to stand in a field and say the name of someone they were being handed to like that, flatly, like it was just information. "They in the house. I told them to wait outside." He almost smiled at that. "Good." He walked back with her, and he could see them from 20 yards out, 2 men standing in front of a car that was somehow even more expensive looking than the one Solt had driven, which Caleb hadn't thought was possible. Robert Langford was exactly what Caleb expected. Tall, silver-haired, the build of a man who'd been athletic once, and now used money the way other men used muscle. He held himself like someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, and was simply waiting for the room to acknowledge it. Graham Hartley was younger, maybe 38, handsome in the way that looks designed rather than earned, wearing a jacket that fit too well to be anything but custom. He stood with his hands in his pockets, and a smile that was already forming, before Caleb was close enough for it to mean anything. Robert Langford spoke first. "You must be Mercer." Caleb stopped in front of them. He didn't extend his hand. "Mr. Langford, I appreciate you making time." Robert's voice carried the mild warmth of a man who didn't actually need your appreciation, but understood the social utility of pretending he did. "We were in the area and thought it made sense to check in personally on Ava's arrangement." "You were in the area," Caleb said. "That's right. Billings is 4 hours from here." Robert's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "As I said, we were in the area." Caleb looked at him for a moment, then at Graham, who was still holding the smile, patient, pleasant, the kind of man who'd learned early that a good smile in silence was often more threatening than words. "Mr. Mercer," Graham said, stepping forward with the easy confidence of someone extending a hand for the first time and fully expecting it to be taken. "Graham Hartley, it's good to meet you." Caleb shook the hand, firm, brief. "What do you want?" Graham laughed a practiced laugh, smooth and social. "Straight to it. I like that." He glanced at Ava, and the smile shifted almost imperceptibly, taking on a quality Caleb recognized immediately, the proprietary warmth of a man looking at something he considers his. "We just wanted to see how things were going. Make sure Ava's comfortable." "Ava's fine," Caleb said. "She looks it," Graham said, and the way he said it, almost admiring, like he was evaluating something that had been out of his sight for a month and was checking on its condition, made Caleb go very still inside, in the way he used to go, still in the Navy, right before something needed doing. "Would you mind?" Robert said, addressing Caleb with the tone of someone who would absolutely mind if the answer was yes. "If Graham and Ava had a few minutes. They haven't spoken in." "I'm right here," Ava said. Both men looked at her, And Caleb saw it, the half-beat of surprise in Robert's face, the recalibration. He'd expected her to be softer. A month on a farm was supposed to have done something to her spirit. He was checking the results of his experiment. "Of course," Robert said smoothly. "Ava, sweetheart." "Don't." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it now. "Don't do the sweetheart. Not today." Robert's expression went carefully neutral. "You seem tense." "I seem clear," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." Caleb didn't move or speak. He didn't need to. He was simply there, present, solid, not going anywhere, and he understood that his presence was already saying what needed to be said. Graham stepped slightly closer to Ava. Not threateningly, almost gently. "Ava, we've given you time, real time. I think you know that this," he gestured almost kindly toward the farm, "isn't a permanent answer. Your father and I are not the same person," she said. "Stop speaking as a unit." Graham blinked. Something behind his polished surface moved briefly like a stone shifting underwater. "I'd like that conversation," Robert said to Caleb with the directness of a man finally deciding to drop the social performance. "If you don't mind. With me or with her? With you." Caleb looked at Ava. She met his eyes and gave a small nod. She was fine, she could handle Graham for a few minutes, she was not going to shatter. He read all of that in a look. He nodded back. "Around front," he said to Robert, and walked. They stood at the front of the house out of earshot, and Robert Langford folded his hands in front of him and dropped the performance entirely. The warmth was gone. What was under it was not cold exactly. It was something more impersonal than cold. It was the face of a man who had been doing business his entire life and saw very little difference between a boardroom and a dirt road in Montana. "How much?" he said. Caleb looked at him. "I'm sorry. Your arrangement with Solt is 90 days. I want to end it at 30. I'll compensate you for the full term, plus let's say 20% above." "She's not a lease," Caleb said. Robert's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not suggesting she is. I'm offering you a business resolution to a situation that became more complicated than intended." "What became more complicated?" "Ava." He said her name like a problem he was naming. "She was supposed to come here, do whatever it is you do, and come home more reasonable. That's not happening." "No," Caleb said. "It's not. She's getting more stubborn. She's getting stronger." Robert looked at him the way men like him look at people who say things they find irrelevant. "Mr. Mercer, you're a former serviceman, single father. You have a farm with a mortgage you're behind on and a daughter in elementary school. I'm offering you a clean solution that helps your situation significantly." He paused. "I'm trying to be reasonable here." "No," Caleb said. "You're trying to find the number." Robert said nothing. "The number you think I'll take. You've been doing it since you got out of that car. You're trying to figure out what this is worth to me in dollars so you can buy your way out of the fact that your daughter doesn't want to do what you've decided she's going to do." Caleb kept his voice level. "There's no number. You're being naive." "Maybe, but I'm also the man whose property she's on, and she has not asked to leave, and you don't have any legal standing to force the issue for another 62 days. So," he looked at Robert steadily, "you can stay for coffee, or you can get back in your car. But this conversation is finished." Robert Langford stared at him for a long moment. Caleb could feel the weight of it, the force of a man who was not accustomed to being told no by anyone, let alone a farmer with grease under his fingernails. But he'd felt heavier weight than this. He'd stood in worse wind than this. Finally, Robert said, "You should be very careful, Mercer." "I'm always careful," Caleb said. "It's the careless people I worry about." Around the back of the house, Ava and Graham were standing about 6 feet apart, and the distance between them had a texture to it, not empty space, but the specific tension of two people who know each other well enough to know exactly what words would wound, and are both for different reasons, choosing not to use them yet. "You look good," Graham said. "The outdoors agrees with you." "Graham, don't." "I mean it. You look like yourself. More than you have in a while." She turned to face him directly. "What does that mean?" "It means—" He paused, recalibrated. "It means I miss you. That I've been patient because I understand that you were upset, and that the way things were presented to you could have been handled better." "The way they were presented," she repeated. "Graham, my father told me at dinner. He told me over salmon and a 40-year-old bottle of wine that he and you had come to an understanding and that you would be getting married in the spring and that he expected me to be happy about it. That is not a presentation problem." "I know how it looked." "Do you know how it felt?" Her voice was steady, but the emotion was right behind it, not hidden, present, contained, but fully there. "Because I'll tell you. It felt like my opinion of my own life was a courtesy question at best. Like I was being consulted as a formality after the decision had already been made." Graham was quiet. Then carefully, "I thought you cared about me." "I did. Parts of you. I still, Graham." She stopped. "That's not the point. The point is that you let that happen. You sat at that table, and you accepted it, and you didn't once think to say, maybe Ava should be part of this conversation." He looked at the ground briefly, and for a moment Caleb would have believed he felt something real. But then the look lifted, and the smoothness was back. "Come home, Ava. We can talk about all of this properly. You can set whatever conditions you need." "Well, I'm not setting conditions on my own freedom," she said. "That's not what that is. You're being dramatic." "And there it is," she said softly. "That's the word that ends every conversation we've ever had where I feel something you find inconvenient. Dramatic." She shook her head. "I'm not dramatic, Graham. I'm done. Those are completely different things." He stared at her. And she stood there and let him stare. And she didn't move, and she didn't look away, and she didn't soften it. That was when Caleb and Robert came around the side of the house. Robert read the situation immediately. Whatever Ava's face was showing, it was not what he'd sent Graham in to produce, and his expression tightened. He looked at Graham. Graham gave the smallest shake of his head. Robert straightened. "Well," he said with the tone of a man postponing, not conceding, "we've taken enough of your time." Caleb said nothing. "Ava." Robert looked at his daughter. "We'll talk." "You know my number," she said. Something passed through Robert's face. Not pain, not quite, but some distant cousin of it. The thing that lives in a controlling man when he realizes the thing he's controlling has outgrown the cage and he hasn't yet decided what to do about that. He walked to the car. Graham followed. He stopped once at the door and looked back at Ava across the yard with an expression that was, and this was the part that stayed with Caleb afterward, not angry. It was something more patient than anger. Something that said, "I'll wait." The car left. Ava didn't say anything for a long time. She stood in the yard and watched the road where the car had been, and Caleb stood beside her and did the same. And Maisie, who had appeared on the porch during the last few minutes of the departure with the uncanny ability of children to materialize at significant moments, came down the steps and stood between them, and looked at the empty road too like she was guarding it. "Are those bad men?" Maisie asked. "Maisie?" Caleb started. "My father isn't a bad man," Ava said. She said it carefully like she'd thought about it a long time. "He just thinks that loving someone means having the right to decide things for them. And those two things have never been the same, and he's never been able to tell the difference." Maisie considered this with her chin tipped up. "That doesn't sound like love," she said. "No," Ava said quietly. "It doesn't." Maisie reached out and took Ava's hand without preamble, without ceremony. The absolute directness of a child who sees that a person needs something and simply provides it. And Ava looked down at the small hand in hers and went very still. Caleb looked away over the fence line over the hills, giving her that. When he looked back, Ava's eyes were bright. She didn't cry. She just held Maisie's hand and breathed, and after a moment, she put her other hand over Maisie's and held it with both. "Thank you, Bug," she said softly. Maisie nodded, like this was simply the correct thing to have done. "Do you want lemonade?" she asked. Ava laughed wet and real and surprised out of her. Yes, she said. I absolutely do. Maisie went in to get it. That night was the hardest yet. Caleb was at the table when Ava came downstairs at midnight. He'd been there since 11, which she could tell from the cold cup of coffee beside him, and the way he was sitting, not working, just thinking in that particular stillness of his that was never empty, always full of something he wasn't saying. She sat down. He didn't look surprised. "What did my father say to you?" she asked. "He offered to pay me to end the arrangement early." She was quiet for a moment. "How much?" "Doesn't matter." "Caleb." "It doesn't matter, Ava, because I said no before he finished the sentence, and it would have been the same answer at any number he offered." She absorbed that. "He's going to come back. Not like today with lawyers next time. He has lawyers on retainer that make what Solt does look like traffic court. He will find a legal lever if he can't find a financial one, and he will use it." "I know." "You understand what I'm saying? He won't just threaten the arrangement. He'll threaten the farm. He'll threaten—" She stopped, said it plainly. "He'll use Maisie." The room went quiet. Caleb's jaw moved, just slightly. The only visible sign of what that sentence did to him. "He tries that," he said slowly, "and he'll find out what a Navy man with nothing left to lose actually looks like. You have things to lose, that's the whole point. I have Maisie, and this farm." He looked up. "And I told you, nobody on my property gets worn down." She looked at him across the table, with an expression that had moved past gratitude into something more complicated. The place you arrive when someone keeps meaning what they say, and you've spent so long in the company of people who didn't, that you don't quite know how to hold it yet. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not for the first time, but differently this time, like she genuinely needed to understand. It needed to know the architecture of it so she could trust it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When Sarah was sick the last few months, there was a night when it was really bad. And she looked at me and she said, 'Caleb, you can't fix this.' And I said, 'I know.' And she said, 'Then just stay.' That was all she needed. Not a solution, not a rescue, just someone who wasn't going to leave when it got hard." He looked at his hands on the table. "I couldn't fix what was happening to her," he said. "But I could stay, so I did." He looked up. "You came here because someone decided fear was a good tool to use on you. That's not a problem I can solve with a wrench or a fence post, but I can stay. And I can make sure that whatever comes next, you don't face it like you're alone." The kitchen was completely quiet. Ava said, "I don't know how to let people do that." "I know," he said. "You're learning." She sat back in her chair and looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face went soft and certain at the same time, the way things look when they settle into where they're supposed to be. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. If they come with lawyers, we'll deal with it. If they come after the farm, we'll deal with it. If they—" "Ava." He met her eyes and held them. "We." I said we. She held that word, turned it over, felt the weight of it, a small word, 2 letters, the specific gravity of not being alone. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "We." Outside, the Montana wind came up across the fields, and the farmhouse held against it the way it had always held. Built solid, built to last. Built by people who understood that the things worth keeping require exactly that keeping. And inside 2 people who had each lost something that could not be replaced, sat at a kitchen table in the middle of the night and chose quietly and without ceremony to stop facing what was coming as though it were theirs alone to carry. Neither of them slept much that night, but for different reasons than the nights before. The lawyers arrived on a Friday. Not 1, 3. In 2 cars, both dark, both expensive, pulling down the dirt road in the kind of careful convoy that announced itself as serious before anyone stepped out. Caleb watched them from the barn doorway, his arms crossed, his coffee going cold in his hand. He'd known they were coming, not because anyone had called, but because Robert Langford had looked at him across that yard 12 days ago with the patience of a man already planning his next move, and Caleb had spent enough years reading people in high-pressure situations to know that patience like that doesn't wait long before it becomes action. He set down the coffee and walked out to meet them. The lead attorney was a woman sharp-faced 50 or so, carrying a briefcase and the specific energy of someone who was very good at her job and knew it. Her name, she said, was Margaret Holloway, and she represented the Langford family in the matter of Ava Christine Langford and the terms of the residential placement agreement. She said this the way people recite things they've said many times before efficiently without warmth, with the professional neutrality of someone who had learned to keep the human element out of their work because it slowed things down. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we'd like to speak with you and Ms. Langford together if possible." "About what specifically?" "The terms of Ms. Langford's continued stay and the legal circumstances surrounding it." "She's staying because she wants to stay," Caleb said. "That's the only term that matters to me." Holloway looked at him with the mild patience of someone who had heard people say that before and had paperwork that said otherwise. "There are several additional considerations the family would like to address. If we could—" Ava, Caleb called. She appeared on the porch. She'd seen the cars from the kitchen window. He knew that because she was already wearing her careful face, the composed armored version of herself she put on when the world from before showed up. But it was different now than it had been on day one. There was something underneath the composure that hadn't been there before, something grounded and awake, like she knew where her feet were. She came down the steps and stood beside Caleb. Not behind him, beside him. Holloway looked at her. "Ms. Langford, your father has asked me to convey that this is not adversarial. He simply wants to ensure that the arrangement is—" "What does the paperwork say?" Ava asked. Holloway paused. "I'm sorry. You have a briefcase. There's paperwork in it. I know how my father operates, Ms. Holloway." "Ms. Holloway, whatever he told you to say first, the paperwork is what he actually intends. So let's skip the preamble." Ava looked at the briefcase. "What does it say?" Holloway opened the case. She produced a document several pages clipped together and held it out. Ava took it. She read it standing up in the cold without asking to go inside. She read it the way she'd read the farm's financial records, quickly, completely, her eyes moving through the language without losing the thread of it. Caleb watched her face as she read and tracked the small changes in it, the tightening around the eyes on page 2, the stillness that came over her on page 3. She lowered the document. "They're petitioning for a guardianship review," she said to Caleb, her voice even. "They're claiming that my decision-making capacity has been compromised, that I am in a vulnerable state and have been taken advantage of." Caleb looked at Holloway. "Taken advantage of how?" Holloway's expression was practiced and careful. "The family has expressed concern that Ms. Langford's extended stay in an isolated environment with a single male resident may not represent a fully autonomous choice on her part. They are asking the court to—" "She's 34 years old," Caleb said. "Age does not preclude vulnerability, Mr. Mercer." "No," he said. "It doesn't. But it does preclude guardianship absent a medical basis, which you don't have." Holloway looked at him with slight surprise, the look people give when a farmer who fixes fence posts knows what he's talking about. "The family believes they can establish—" "They believe wrong." He kept his voice level the way he kept everything level when the situation was serious. "I want to be very clear about something, Counselor. Ava Langford came to this property under a legal arrangement your client initiated. She has not been coerced, isolated, or manipulated. She has worked this farm, managed its finances, and been a free participant in every decision made here. Your client sent her here because he wanted her worn down and compliant, and instead she got stronger, and now he wants to call that a symptom." He looked at Holloway steadily. "That's not going to work." Holloway looked between them. Whatever she'd expected when she turned down this dirt road, Caleb suspected it wasn't this. "Mr. Mercer, I'd strongly advise you to consult with your own attorney before—" "I'll consult with whoever I need to consult with. But the answer to whatever that document is asking is no. And if your client files it, we'll see him in court." Holloway took a breath, looked at Ava. "Ms. Langford, I want to make sure you understand what— I understand perfectly, Ava said. Tell my father I said no was— They left. The yard was quiet again. The two of them stood there for a moment and let it settle. Then Ava said, I need to call someone. Who? A friend from law school. She practices in Billings now, family law. I should have called her 2 weeks ago, but I kept thinking— She stopped. I kept thinking it wouldn't come to this. Call her, Caleb said. Caleb, if this goes to court, a guardianship filing, even a frivolous one, it costs money. Time. It becomes a matter of public record that could— Call her, he said again. She looked at him. You understand what I'm saying? This could affect you, your reputation, the farm. If they start making accusations about your motivations for keeping me here— Ava. He waited until she stopped. I know what the cost might be. I'm telling you, it doesn't change the answer. She held his gaze for a long moment. Why not? She said. And this time the question wasn't philosophical. It was direct, almost desperate. The question of a person who genuinely could not understand why someone would choose to take on this weight for her. Give me a real answer. Not the Navy loyalty thing. Not the Sarah thing, a real one. Why is this worth it to you? He was quiet for a moment. Because the night you told me what they were doing to you, Maisie was asleep down the hall, he said. And I thought about what it would mean for her to grow up knowing that her father looked the other way when someone needed him to stand up. I don't want to explain that to her. He paused. And because you're worth standing up for. That's the whole answer. Ava looked at him, and the careful composure she'd been maintaining since the cars pulled in finally released its tension, not collapsing, but letting go the difference between a wall breaking and a fist opening. Okay, she said quietly. Go call your friend. Caleb. Yeah. Thank you. He picked up his coffee from the fence post where he'd set it, looked at it. Stone cold. Don't thank me yet, he said. Let's see how it goes first. Her friend's name was Diana Reyes, and she drove up from Billings the next day in a 12-year-old Subaru with a cracked bumper sticker and a legal pad that was already half filled with notes before she sat down at the kitchen table. She was small, quick with the kind of eyes that collected information the way other people collected impressions. She shook Caleb's hand, looked around the kitchen once, looked at Ava and said, You look better than I expected. I feel better than I expected, Ava said. Good, we're going to need that. Diana opened her legal pad. All right, I've reviewed what you sent me. The guardianship petition is thin. They're filing it in Cascade County, which tells me they went forum shopping and still couldn't find a solid angle. It's primarily based on two things, the isolation argument and what they're calling undue influence. She looked at Caleb. That's you. I figured, he said. They'll argue that you have a financial incentive to keep her here, the stipend, and that you've leveraged her emotional vulnerability to create a dependency. Maisie, who was doing homework at the far end of the table, looked up. What does leverage mean? Maisie, Caleb said. I'm doing my homework, she said, and looked back down, but her pencil stopped moving. Diana glanced at the girl and back to Caleb. They may also attempt to introduce Maisie into the argument, the idea that you've used your daughter to create an emotional attachment. Absolutely not, Caleb said. It came out flat and very quiet, and everyone at the table understood exactly what it meant. Diana nodded once. I'm not saying it will succeed. I'm saying you need to know they may try it so you're not caught off guard in the courtroom. She turned to Ava. Now, you're 34, mentally competent, voluntarily resident here, under a legal agreement that your family's own attorney arranged. The petition is survivable, but they have money and they're going to use it. And the judge assigned to this is, let's say he's old-fashioned. Old-fashioned how? Ava asked. He's going to be more sympathetic to family arguments than we'd like. He's going to look at you and see a wealthy woman who walked away from a good situation and ended up on a farm with a single father, and he's going to have questions about that picture. She looked between them. I need to know exactly what the picture actually is. All of it. Because whatever it is, I need to know it before opposing counsel does. Silence. Ava looked at Caleb. He looked at her. And something passed between them that had been building for weeks, wordless, acknowledged in small moments, and then set aside. And now it was sitting on the table in front of Diana Reyes, who was watching them both with the patience of someone who had sat across from many people at many kitchen tables and knew how to read a room. "We work together," Ava said. "We're rebuilding the farm's operations. I've been handling the financial side. Caleb handles everything else. She paused. "We're friends." Diana wrote something on the legal pad. "And Maisie. Maisie is a child who decided she liked me," Ava said. "That's all." Diana looked up. "Is that all?" Ava didn't answer immediately. "It's more than that," Maisie said from the end of the table without looking up from her homework. "Ava helps me with my reading, and sometimes we make dinner together, and she knows how to do braids." She finally looked up. "Is that bad?" Diana smiled briefly. "No, sweetheart. That's actually very good." She made another note. The filing came through the following Thursday. It was worse than Diana had predicted, not in its legal strength, which remained thin, but in its language. The petition described Caleb as a financially distressed individual with documented debts who had cultivated an emotional reliance in a vulnerable woman to secure ongoing financial benefit and companionship. It described the farm as isolated and unfit for extended habitation. It included a section 2 full paragraphs about Maisie suggesting that Ava had been incorporated into the family unit in ways that exceeded the scope of the arrangement and created artificial bonds inconsistent with free choice. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Maisie was at school and Ava sat across from him. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "They're going to make this about everything I have left." "Yes," Ava said. "They're going to put my finances in front of a judge, and they're going to talk about Maisie." "Caleb. That's my daughter." His voice was controlled, but just barely. "She's 9 years old, and she's already lost her mother, and I am not going to sit in a courtroom while people in suits talk about her like she's a piece of evidence." "I know." Ava leaned forward. "I know. And I am so sorry. This is my fault. Don't. If I hadn't." "Ava." He looked at her directly. "You didn't do this. They did this. There's a difference, and I need you to be clear on that difference because we can't afford for you to spend the next 3 weeks carrying blame that belongs to your father." She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "What do you want to do?" "I want to fight it. It could get worse. They have resources we don't, and they're willing to make this ugly. I've been in ugly before. Not like this." "No," he admitted. "Not exactly like this." He looked at the petition on the table. "But I'll tell you something about the Navy. They train you to expect that the situation will get worse before it gets better. They train you to hold your position anyway. Not because you're sure you'll win, because you're sure that walking away is worse." She looked at him for a long time. "I don't want you to lose the farm because of me," she said. "Then help me keep it." She straightened. "What do you need? Everything. Every piece of documentation we have on the arrangement. Every financial record that shows the work we've done here together. And..." He paused. "I need you to be honest with Diana about everything. Not the careful version. Everything." "Everything," she repeated. "Whatever they think the picture is, the truth is better. It always is." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "You should know something. About what I feel about what this has become for me here." She said it carefully, choosing each word. "I am not going to pretend in a courtroom or anywhere else that this is just an arrangement. That Maisie is just some child I happen to be near. That you are just a man who let me stay in his house." Her voice was steady and clear. "I am not going to minimize this to make it easier for a judge to understand." Caleb looked at her. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." The night before the hearing, Maisie couldn't sleep. She came downstairs at 9:30 and stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, and both Caleb and Ava were at the table. Diana's materials spread out between them. coffee going cold for the third time that evening, and she looked at the papers, and then at her father, and then at Ava. "Is tomorrow the day they decide?" she asked. "Yeah, bug," Caleb said. "It is." She came to the table and climbed into the chair beside him. "And if they decide wrong, do they take the farm?" "They're not taking the farm," he said. "But if... Maisie." He turned to face her fully. He put his hand over hers on the table. "I need you to listen to me, and believe what I'm telling you. I have never told you something was going to be okay when it wasn't. Have I?" She thought about it. "When Buckwheat died, you told me he was okay, and he wasn't." "The horse," he said to Ava briefly. Then back to Maisie. "That's fair, but every other time. Have I told you something was fine when it wasn't?" She shook her head. "So when I tell you tomorrow is going to be all right, I need you to give me that." She looked at him, at Ava, back at him. "Both of you are going to be there." "Both of us," Ava said. Maisie sat with that. Then she looked at Ava with the kind of directness that 9-year-olds have before the world teaches them to soften things. "Are you going to leave after the hearing? After everything? When it's over? Are you going to go back to where you came from?" The table was quiet. Ava looked at this girl, this small, serious, heartbreakingly perceptive girl, with her father's steady eyes, and she felt something that she'd been circling for weeks. Something she hadn't let herself land on, because landing on it meant it was real, and real things could be taken away. "I don't want to," she said. And it was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in years. Maisie studied her for a moment longer. Then she nodded satisfied and looked at Caleb. "Okay," she said. "I'm going back to bed." "Good night, Bug." She slid off the chair, stopped at the doorway, turned back. "Ava," she said. "Yeah." "I don't want you to either." She went upstairs. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb stared at the table in front of him. Ava stared at the doorway where Maisie had been. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the silence between them was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but of people who had too much and were standing at the edge of it, feeling its weight, deciding whether they were ready to step forward. It was Ava who moved first. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, not dramatically, not with any declaration. Just placed it there, open and present, the way you place something down that you've been carrying too long. And he looked at her hand, and then at her face, and he turned his hand over and held it. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Some things don't require words. Some things are said in the simple, hard-won act of two people deciding without ceremony that whatever comes tomorrow, they are not walking into it alone. Outside, the wind had gone still. The Montana sky was full of stars, the same stars that had surprised Ava on her first night here, that she'd stared at from the porch steps like she hadn't known they existed, and the farm was quiet, and the house was warm, and 3 people under its roof were preparing in their different ways for the morning that would decide everything. Caleb picked up the papers. "We should go through Diana's notes one more time," he said. "Yeah," Ava said. She didn't let go of his hand. "We should," he said again, and he didn't let go either. They sat at the table with the papers between them and worked through the night, and the coffee went cold again, and neither of them noticed, and by the time the first gray light of morning came through the kitchen window, they were ready. Not because they weren't afraid, because they'd decided that being afraid wasn't the same as being beaten. The courthouse in Cascade County was not an impressive building. It was the kind of place that looked exactly like what it was, a county seat institution in a small Montana city, practical and unadorned with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people who had come here with their hardest problems and sat in those seats waiting for someone to tell them how it was going to go. Caleb had driven past it 100 times over the years without ever thinking he'd have reason to go inside. He pulled the truck into the lot at 7:50, 40 minutes before the 9 o'clock hearing. Ava was in the passenger seat. Diana was already there standing by her Subaru with her coat buttoned and her legal pad in hand, and she looked up when they parked and gave them a nod that was efficient and reassuring at the same time. Maisie was at school. Caleb had dropped her off at 7:15, and she'd hugged him at the door longer than usual, and then looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "You've got this, Dad," in exactly the tone he used when he said it to her, and he'd had to take a breath on the walk back to the truck because 9 years old, and already she could undo him completely. He and Ava walked toward the courthouse side by side, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and that was right. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. They'd been through Diana's notes 4 times. They knew the arguments. They knew what Langford's legal team was going to try to do, and they knew how Diana intended to answer it, and they had made their peace each in their own way with the fact that what happened in the next few hours was going to change something. The question was only what. Diana fell into step beside them. "They're already inside," she said. "Holloway 2 associates and a man named Bernard Crane, who I have seen in this courthouse before. He is very good and very expensive, and he likes long sentences." "Great," Ava said. "He likes to make simple things sound complicated. Our job is to make complicated things sound simple." Diana looked at her. "How are you?" "Ready," Ava said. Diana looked at Caleb. "You." "Let's go," he said. And Robert Langford was already seated at the petitioner's table when they came in, and he looked up when they entered, and his eyes went to Ava first, then to Caleb, and then back to Ava, and his expression did what it always did, that careful, controlled neutrality that said nothing and meant everything. Graham was not there. Caleb noted that, and filed it away. Holloway stood, spoke briefly to Bernard Crane. A large gray-haired man with reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had never once been in a hurry because urgency was something that happened to other people. He glanced at Caleb across the room with the mild professional curiosity of a man sizing up an opposing argument. Caleb sat down, folded his hands on the table, looked at the front of the room and waited. The judge's name was Gerald Patton. He came in at 9:03, settled himself behind the bench with the deliberateness of a man who understood that his pace set the pace, and looked at the room over the top of his glasses. "Langford Family Petition," he said, opening the file. "Guardianship Review, Ava Christine Langford." He looked at both tables. "I've read the filing. I've read the response. Let's hear it." Bernard Crane stood. He was smooth and measured, and he built the Langford argument the way you build a fire, carefully, one piece at a time, starting with the least inflammatory and working toward the heat. He spoke about family concern. He spoke about the circumstances of Ava's placement, the isolated location, the financial situation of the resident, the unusual nature of the arrangement. He spoke about what he called the accelerated emotional integration between Ava and the Mercer household, and he used that phrase with just enough clinical detachment to make it sound like a symptom rather than a relationship. He was careful never to call Caleb a predator directly. He didn't need to. He just kept placing the pieces until the picture assembled itself in the mind of anyone watching. Caleb sat through it. His face showed nothing. Under the table, his right hand was flat against his knee, a thing he did when he needed to stay completely still. Diana stood when Crane sat down. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner has presented a story. What they have not presented is evidence." She held up a finger. "First, Ava Langford is a 34-year-old woman with a graduate degree and 4 years of professional financial experience. The claim that she is incapable of determining her own living circumstances requires a medical or psychological basis. The petitioner has none. What they have is a father who disagrees with his daughter's choices, which is not a guardianship condition. It's a Tuesday." Patton's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted slightly. He made a note. "Second," Diana continued, "the residential arrangement in question was initiated, documented, and paid for by the Langford family themselves through their own legal representative. The petitioner created the conditions they are now characterizing as harmful. That is not a legal argument. That is a contradiction." She paused. "And third, the suggestion that Mr. Mercer, a decorated Navy veteran and the sole parent of a 9-year-old girl, has manipulated a financially sophisticated adult woman for personal gain is not supported by a single piece of documented evidence in this filing. It is supported only by the fact that the petitioner would prefer a different outcome to his daughter's life. She sat down. Patton looked at Crane. "Counsel, I have a question." Crane stood. "Your Honor." The filing includes a section regarding the minor child, the respondent's daughter. Patton looked at the document. "What is the legal relevance of that section to the guardianship petition?" Crane opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Honor, the family's position is that the involvement of the child in establishing—" "What is the legal relevance?" Patton repeated, "to the guardianship question?" A pause. "It speaks to the nature of the relationship between—" "There is no legal relevance," Patton said. He looked at Robert Langford directly for the first time. "That section of the filing is stricken. I will not have a 9-year-old child used as evidentiary leverage in a proceeding of this nature." He made a note. "Continue." Caleb allowed himself one breath. What happened next was not a dramatic reversal. There was no moment where a crucial piece of evidence emerged and the room gasped. Real courtrooms are not like that. What happened was slower and more grinding than that. It was Diana methodically answering every argument, presenting documentation of the farm's financial recovery. The terms of the legitimate agreement, 2 character statements from community members in the county who knew Caleb, and a 1-page written statement from Ava herself that Diana read aloud in full. Ava had written it at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. 3 nights before the hearing. She had read it to Caleb when she finished, and he had sat across from her and listened to every word, and when she finished he had said only, "That's true," and she had said, "I know," and they had left it at that. Diana read it clearly without performance. "I am here because I chose to stay. I chose to stay because for the first time in several years, I was in a place where my choices were my own. I was not managed, directed, or leveraged. I was given work honesty and the space to become clear about what I wanted from my life. I am not a victim of the circumstances my family is describing. I am a woman who found her footing. The only threat to my well-being in this situation is the petition itself." The room was quiet when Diana finished. Robert Langford looked at the table in front of him. Caleb looked at him looking at it, and he tried to find something recognizable in the man's face. Regret, or love miscalculated, or the particular grief of a parent who has pushed so hard that they pushed their child somewhere they can't follow. He thought he saw something briefly. Then Robert straightened, and it was gone. Crane made his closing argument. Diana made hers. Patton took 20 minutes. He came back in, sat down, and looked at both tables with the same measured gravity he'd brought to the whole proceeding. "This petition," he said, "does not meet the legal standard for guardianship review. The petitioner has not established diminished capacity, undue influence, or any condition that would warrant court intervention in the residential choices of a competent adult." He looked at Robert Langford. "The family's concern for Ms. Langford is noted. Concern, however, does not constitute cause. Petition is denied." He closed the file. Court is adjourned. They stood outside on the courthouse steps in the cold Montana morning, and Diana said, "That's it," with the pragmatic simplicity of someone who'd done this enough times to know that the most important moments rarely look the way people expect them to. Ava said, "That's it. That's it. Filed and denied. It's on record. If they refile, they'll need substantially more than they had today, and they know it." Diana looked at her. "Your father is not done. Men like Robert Langford are never done on the first try. But the legal angle is closed for now, and that means you have time." Ava turned to Caleb. He was standing 2 steps below her, looking out at the street, and she could see in his profile the particular stillness that meant he was processing something internally, feeling the weight of it, fully absorbing it, the way he did everything steadily and without performance. "Caleb," she said. He turned. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she'd wanted to say for weeks, the thing she'd been circling, the thing she'd approached and then pulled back from, because it was real, and real things were terrifying in a way that abstractions never were. She thought about what she'd written in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She thought about Maisie's voice in the dark of the courthouse steps the night before. "I don't want you to either." "I'm not going back," she said. He looked at her. "I know my 90 days is almost up. I know the arrangement ends, but I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "This is not the farm talking. This is not gratitude. And this is not fear of going back to something. I have thought about this very clearly, and I know the difference." She held his gaze. "I want to stay, not as an arrangement, not as a guest. I want to stay, and I want to build what we started here, and I want to be—" She stopped again, and her voice was steady, but it was held there by deliberate effort, and he could hear both the steadiness and the effort at once. "I want to be here. With you. With Maisie. If that's—" She stopped. "Tell me if that's something you want too." Caleb looked at her for a long time. And then he came up the 2 steps and stood in front of her, and he said, "I have been wanting to tell you something since about the 3rd week you were on my property, and I have been waiting because I didn't want to be the man who says something like that to a woman in a complicated situation who might feel like she owes him an answer." "I don't owe you anything," she said. "I know. So tell me." He looked at her. "I don't want you to leave either. I haven't wanted you to leave for a long time. And it's not because you fix the supply contracts, or because Maisie does her homework more reliably when you're at the table, or because the farm is doing better than it's done in 3 years. He paused. "It's because you sat on my porch steps on your first night here and looked at stars you'd never seen before, like they were something personal, and I thought, there it is. There's a person who is about to wake up." He held her eyes. "And I wanted to see it happen. I have been watching it happen, and I do not want to stop." Diana, standing 6 feet away, with her legal pad under her arm, looked very carefully at the middle distance and said nothing. Ava put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, the same direct simplicity that Maisie had shown when she'd reached for Ava's hand in the yard, and she said, "Okay." He covered her hand with his. "Okay," he said. 3 months later, the sign went up. It was Maisie's idea, not the business itself, which had been Ava's, laid out at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and projected figures, and the same financial clarity she brought to everything but the sign. Maisie had decided it needed a sign, and she had made one herself out of a piece of barnboard and paint she'd found in the shed. And it was crooked, and the letters were slightly different sizes, and it was exactly perfect. It said, "Mercer's Coffee Provisions and Good Company." The small cafe operated out of the refurbished barn space, open 4 days a week, and it was Ava's business acumen married to the farm's practical identity. Local honey preserves eggs, the kind of real coffee that the county had been driving 40 minutes for, and something less nameable that people felt when they sat down in that space. Something that had to do with the way it had been built by hand, by people who understood that a place becomes what the people in it are willing to put into it. It was a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the cafe had opened, and the place was full. Caleb was behind the counter because Ava had needed him there, and he was better at it than either of them had expected. Something about a man who could replace a fence post and stand in a courtroom with the same steady bearing translated, it turned out into someone customers trusted. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just poured coffee and listened, and people left feeling like something had been paid attention to. Ava moved between tables with the ease of someone who had found exactly the thing her abilities were built for. Not the corporate version of finance, but this, the practical, alive version of it, something you could touch and taste and hand to a neighbor. She had called her mother 2 weeks after the hearing. It was a hard conversation, and it was a real one, and nothing was resolved, and nothing was abandoned. And that was probably the most honest thing she'd said about her family in years, that it was unresolved, and she was willing to live with that. Her father had not called. She thought about that sometimes. Not with anger anymore, with something quieter and more complicated that she was still finding words for. Maisie was at a table in the corner with 2 girls from her class, and she was explaining something with the emphatic hand gestures she used when she was certain she was right about a thing. and one of the girls was laughing, and Maisie looked up across the room and found Caleb's eyes, and gave him the nod, the specific particular nod that meant everything is fine. And I'm happy and I see you, and he gave it back. He looked over at Ava. She was talking to an older couple at the table near the window, leaning forward with her elbows on the chair back, and she said something that made the woman laugh, and she looked up at the same moment. Caleb looked across the room, and their eyes met over the full and warm and living space that they had built together, and she smiled at him. Not the careful smile from the first days, not the relieved smile from the courthouse steps, but something deeper and quieter than either the kind of smile that only exists on the face of a person who has come home. He smiled back. And outside on the post by the road, that had once been just a dirt track leading to a struggling farm, the barn board sign moved slightly in the cold Montana wind, and the letters Maisie had painted with 9-year-old determination said what they said. That night, after the last customer had gone, and Maisie was asleep, and the cafe was quiet and clean, and closed, Caleb and Ava sat on the porch steps the way they had on her first night. The same stars overhead, the same cold air, the same dark hills, and he reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. And neither of them needed to say anything, because everything that needed to be said had already been said in the work they'd done together, in the fights they'd stood through together, in the mornings they'd started, and the nights they'd ended, and the 1,000 ordinary moments between. That had quietly become the whole shape of their lives. There is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in with sirens or speeches. It comes in on a dirt road on a gray morning, in the form of a decision to stay, to stand, to build something in the place you're standing, even when the ground is hard and the cost is real, and there is no guarantee of anything except that walking away would be worse than staying. Caleb Mercer had learned that in the Navy, and then in the frozen ground beside his wife's grave, and then again in the 5 years after, and then one more time, the deepest time. On the morning, a black car came down his road, and a terrified woman stepped out of it, and his life became something he hadn't expected, and couldn't have planned, and would not have traded for anything in the world. He had stayed. They had built it, and what they built was exactly that, something worth fighting for, something worth staying for, something that stood against the wind, not because nothing could touch it, but because the people inside it had decided together, and without flinching, that it was worth the cost of keeping. That was the whole story, and it was enough.